There's much to say on this subject, and much of it will have to be left unsaid if I'm going to not run over the hour and cut into the time allotted for questions. But I also wonder what more needs to be said than that these are bad, dark times for Jews. How bad? A young Jewish woman, a master's student, relates, I was wearing a JSOC, a Jewish Society jumper, on campus, and someone spat on me as they walked past. And Shylock's protest to Antonio comes to mind, doesn't it? You spat on my Jewish gabardine. For Venice's Rialto, read University campus. For Jewish gabardine, read JSOC jumper. Other Jewish university students have related similar experiences. After leaving a bagel lunch from the Jewish chaplaincy on campus, I was spat at. I wear a Magen David. I have been spat at and shouted at and not allowed to enter certain areas in the university. I have been told I should have died in the gas chambers. What does it mean to spit at a Jew at her place of study? You are not wanted here. You do not merit the ordinary civilities. You are an object of disgust. Expressions of disgust are therefore your portion. Spitting at a Jew becomes a moral act, something to be done precisely in public, in demonstration of virtue, as an act of witness, a refusal of complicity with the Jew. Now, let us agree that a student spitting at another student is an objectionable, reprehensible act. And that when the student is spat at because she is Jewish, let us agree that it's an objectionable, reprehensible, anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic act. And last, let us also agree that for it to be necessary for me to say these things, and it is necessary, is a sign of quite how bad these bad times are. It's my disagreeable task this evening to speak about such objectionable, reprehensible, anti-Semitic acts and language, to communicate some sense of their weight and consequence, and to protest against them. How could one not protest against them? It's a puzzle and a scandal that they are regarded with complacency by so many people. So, my subject is anti-Semitism today. By today, I mean the period that began on 7th October 2023, a period of two moments. The moment of the terror attack and the moment of the military campaign. The response to the one and the response to the other. The terror attack, 7th October itself, when Hamas terrorists invaded Israel to murder, rape, and abduct Israeli citizens and other defenseless citizens. Over 1,000 people were killed. Elderly women and children were among the over 240 people seized. Bodies were mutilated. The kidnapped were paraded in the streets of Gaza City. Some hostages was sexually assaulted, others have been murdered in captivity. This terror attack was on Israel itself, the national entity, with the intent of initiating a maximally violent process, one that would only end with Israel's dismantling, its destruction. The months thereafter, the military campaign, when Israel invaded Gaza with the declared aim of rescuing the hostages and destroying Hamas, which meant, among other things, destroying the approximately 500 kilometers of tunnels, many built under heavily populated areas at a cost of approximately $1 billion. This undertaking, of course, we know, has caused immense destruction to the region and an estimated 43,000 casualties, both terrorists and civilians. Of the diverse responses to these events, I have in mind the welcoming or exculpatory response by some to the terror attack, and some aspects, certain aspects, of the condemnatory response to the military campaign, the second moment, that's very extended second moment, led by people who welcomed the terror attack and joined by some who did not. It's this combination of events and responses that defines our new conjuncture, our today. And it is a new conjuncture, not a mere episode. Simply put, for Jews, there is no going back to 6th of October 2023.
Okay.
What I mean by anti-Semitism is the concern of what follows. I simply note for now that anti-Semitism for some time has had a poor name because it's been associated with everything that is stupid and malicious and menacing. Few people wish to be thought cruel or stupid, fewer still to be thought to menace others. Indeed, there are very few anti-Semites today who are not declared enemies of anti-Semitism. I want to summarize the 4 propositions that this lecture comprises because when I wrote it out, it came to about 12,000 words, and even the most tolerant and patient of audiences would not stand a 12,000 word lecture. I mean, there's anti-Semitism and then there's listening to a 12,000 word lecture. So I'm going to identify the propositions and I'll try and indicate where, for those who have any appetite left for what I have to say on the subject, the material will be found online. But the propositions, the 4 propositions, are quite simply put. And the first proposition is that anti-Semitism is a proper topic for consideration. One has to assume nothing, and one has to start with that proposition. That is the foundational proposition of my discourse. While there are many topics to be addressed in relation to today, the world post 7th October, anti-Semitism is one of those topics. For sure, it's not the only one. It is perhaps not even the most important one. The likelihood of a 3rd World War is the best candidate for that. We live in a world, to borrow a great formulation of Adorno and Horkheimer, radiant with triumphant calamity. And yet, even in the shadow of this question, anti-Semitism is still worth discussing. Indeed, I would go further. The only perspective which rules out such a topic is one that holds Jews as such, with Gaza in view, a perpetrator people. In this perspective, every Jew is culpable Jewish guilt is collective, inescapable. No Jew has an excuse, and all talk of anti-Semitism misses this essential point. Let me say, this is not my perspective. Proposition 2. There have been responses to the attack and responses to the campaign that are reprehensible. The protesters on 8th October in Sydney, who chanted, "Forgive me, fuck the Jews," and burned an Israeli flag. The London journalist's tweet, "Today should be a day of celebration for supporters of democracy and human rights worldwide. It was so beautiful and inspiring to see," said one speaker at a rally in Brighton. The social media invitations to rejoice as Palestinian resistance humiliates racist Israel, to admire the most inspiring act of resistance, etc. And since then, across the period of the campaign, across Europe's cities, Israeli flags have been burned, and this is important, outside synagogues. A Jewish cemetery was set alight, swastikas daubed on the walls. Multiple visibly Jewish homes have been marked with anti-Semitic graffiti. A man brandishing a knife was stopped by police outside a synagogue. In the United States, a man fired shots outside a synagogue, declared Free Palestine when arrested. A woman drove her car into a school building, believing it to be a Jewish school. For context for these anecdotes, I note here that 1,978 anti-Semitic incidents in the UK were recorded by the Community Security Trust in the first 6 months of 2024, 44% higher than the previous half-year record in 2021 of 1,371 incidents. Proposition number 3. These reprehensible terror attack, military campaign responses are correctly described as anti-Semitic. And they comprise, in their anti-Semitism, both historical and novel elements. The principal historical element is the libel that Jews make victim of non-Jews and make false claims about their own victimhood in pursuit of that objective. We recognize this second aspect in the often repeated allegation that Jews weaponize anti-Semitism. That is, that when they talk about anti-Semitism, they do so in bad faith to give themselves and their fellow Jews an excuse for pursuing a murderous campaign against Palestinians, or to distract attention from that campaign. The principal new element is the final retiring of arguments about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, by which I mean anti-Zionism in its present dominant form. They are now routes to the same lethal outcome. We can term the hatred and the malice, the threats and the violence, anti-Semitism, or we can term it the current iteration of anti-Zionism, and it doesn't matter. Earlier versions of anti-Zionism, including the intra-communal anti-Zionisms of the late 19th century, large parts of the 20th century, have little continuing salience now, though this may change. They're mostly an affair of private definition without organizational heft. I want to argue that avoiding this anti-Semitism, this new combination of historical and novel elements, is a moral duty, one not difficult to honor. Indeed, it is a matter of honor to avoid it. Fourth, last proposition, but not the end of this lecture, the Jewish world finds itself in a new conjuncture. The impact of these anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist responses are of such consequence that they have created a new conjuncture, a new hostile environment, it will take some time before Jews find their bearings in this environment, given both its novelty and its sheer unwelcomeness, as well as a certain ceaselessness of assault. Media misreporting, insulting, abusive graffiti, scratched off posters of the kidnapped, the coldness and worse of many workplaces, schools and universities, puzzling police decisions, etc., etc. Jews are bewildered, dismayed, uncertain. This unmastered present induces a paralysis, including a paralysis in thinking. The Jewish world will rally, of course. It will find the necessary resolve and clarity of purpose. Jews will even find in this new environment a certain shifting of burdens. That is, they will give up pointlessly, ignominiously appealing to the good faith of anti-Semites, and they will, in due course, with full open-mindedness, interrogate their own collective situation in the various groupings to which we belong. I now turn to the partial elaboration of these propositions. But I should take my watch off so I know how I'm doing. So, proposition number one, anti-Semitism is a proper topic for consideration, among the other topics. And I say this for 5 reasons. First, anti-Semitism is now a balefully oppressive presence in Jewish lives. Jews therefore want to talk about it, to testify to it. Implicit in this witnessing and appeal lies, though it's rarely heard. Throughout history, anti-Semites have threatened Jewish lives, Jewish security, and Jewish morale. They would deny to Jews rights others enjoy. They would withhold from Jews equality of treatment and regard. Jews cannot be silent regarding these burdens. Call this the Jewish reason for addressing this topic. Second, anti-Semitism does not just harm Jews. It also encourages misconceptions about the causes of social conflicts and human suffering and social deprivation, thereby prolonging their existence to general disadvantage. By denying Jews the opportunity of making contributions to society, anti-Semitism injures all society's members. It corrupts political discourse, it taints political life, its injustices towards Jews are precedent establishing. It even injures anti-Semites, degrading them and making them stupid. Call this the Democrats' reason. Third, that idle quarrel between anti-Semites and anti-racists, a feature of progressive political activity in the last decade, in which the anti-Semites hold the anti-racists to be complicit in anti-Semitism, and the anti-racists hold the anti-Semites to be self-pitying, privileged white people. I caricature, but only slightly. It can only be resolved by a mutual understanding, which, among other things, recognizes anti-Semitism as a potent, oppressive presence. Call this the anti-racist reason. Fourth, if anti-Semitism is to be combated, it must be understood. It must be grasped in its persistence over centuries, in its dizzying diversity of form and expression, in the breadth of its appeal, and in its typical exception-making. Only rarely are all Jews a target. Call this the activist's reason. Last, anti-Semitism is a topic for academic inquiry. I testify to that myself. It properly engages the attention of historians and literary critics, social scientists and psychologists. Among the lines of inquiry is this one: how to explain the continuities of language and action between historical and current episodes of Jew hatred, the former generally acknowledged, the latter fiercely disputed. That's the academic's reason for addressing this topic. However, I want to acknowledge here two counter reasons, two objections to addressing anti-Semitism in the context of our post-7th October world. The first derives from the same source that drives the tearing down of hostage photographs, an exasperation with Jews, an indignant rejection of their appeal for sympathy. We can give this counter reason another formulation. Jews with an attachment to Israel should be prepared to take without complaint all expressions of outrage at the continuing Gaza catastrophe, even if some of those expressions are immoderate or worse, even if they catch local, wholly uninvolved Jews in their sweep. Wear a kippah, join a JSOC, pray in a shul, accept the risks. The second counter reason is grounded in the conviction that given the greater suffering, I'm speaking here about the devastation of Gaza, the dead and wounded, the homeless and displaced, the disease, the impoverishment, the daily horror, it is unseemly, it is indecorous to notice mere insult and rebuff, chants and graffiti, threats and menaces, synagogues burned down and Jews intimidated and assaulted. Of course, there is a point at which the list becomes indisputably oppressive, and indeed recalls to mind those comparable insults and rebuffs, etc., which in earlier moments of Jewish history were the preliminaries to the most immense of horrors. But still, this second counter reason is a serious counter reason. And the reasons, and certainly the second counter reason, must be weighed. What I say this evening is the outcome of my own process of weighing. That I'm speaking further, of course, indicates I find the reasons more persuasive in the next 35 minutes than the counter reason. In brief, what matters, matters. And it doesn't stop mattering just because other things matter too. Second proposition. The responses in the most general terms to the terror attack and the military campaign, the one word is resistance and the other word is genocide. These responses are wrong and reprehensible in the symmetrical extravagance of their expression. Death wears two masks in this universe, one angelic and one satanic. The holy good confronts the holy wicked, pure victims at the mercy of demonic aggressors. No one should be surprised when Jews protest at being cast as the villains in this global theological struggle. We have been here before. The responses to the terror attack, the reprehensible responses, have ethical and psychodynamic and cognitive aspects. It's patently unethical to welcome a well-funded, state-backed massacre perpetrated by a group planning to conquer land, one rape, one murder at a time, with a view to eliminating a nation and inflicting incalculable suffering on the region's entire population. Hannah Arendt's judgment came to my mind when I was writing this. Violence, she says, can be justifiable, but it never will be legitimate. Its justification loses in plausibility the farther its intended end recedes into the future. Now, in the case of this conflict, there is no end if violence is pursued. Only a preciseless, endless cycle of death and destruction and misery. Regarding the psychodynamic, the celebrations of the terror attack contained an element of sadism, responsive to the predatory sadism of the attack itself. The protesters give themselves permission to be cruel. In our effectively over-policed society, this permission doubtless represents a psychic release, one that can be re-experienced over and over again in marches, in demonstrations, and encampments. The cognitive aspect, what I have in mind here is the indifference to the truth, to true accounts of the terror attack, or a denial of those true accounts. A flat denial or a phony skepticism of the "I'm keeping an open mind, questions need to be asked" and so on that we have heard so much of. The political unconscious, in which there is no law of contradiction, has found ready expression in current times. It didn't happen, and we're happy it happened. These cognitive failings draw strength from the trope that Jews lie about their suffering. Now, the responses to the military campaign, of course, significantly overlap with the responses that I just described. But it's very important, allow me to say this again, that we distinguish the responses that are the object of my hostile attention from those responses that are to be characterized by a compassionate and necessary regard for all victims of human rights violations, without respect to their ascribed ideological or ethnic status. And I suspect, I hope, I believe, that this is the majority response of people engaged with these horrors. Empathetic responses taking in the totality of suffering, of fear, of terror, since the early hours of 7th October to today. Displacement of populations, separation of families, death, injury, the horror and the pain is almost too much to contemplate. The reprehensible responses, by contrast, in their deformations of precisely this humanitarian compassion, they too have their moral and their psychodynamic and their cognitive aspects. I'm editing down. On the ethical, let me just say this. There is no defensible logic of complicity, which is a word we hear a lot of, connecting the there of Gaza to the here of London that justifies the abuse, intimidation, and violence directed at Jews as Jews. Just let me affirm that as an ethical proposition. The psychodynamic aspect, if one can step back at all and consider it as an object of study is interesting and complex, because we find sadism in a second register, a certain pleasure in tormenting Jews by dressing them in the clothes of their historical greatest tormentors. They are Nazis, they are committing genocide, they administer concentration camps and so on. And also, there is, we sense, I think, a neurotic fear of contamination. If we are not endlessly vigilant, we're told, we risk the infection of complicity. Political activity then becomes a narcissistic affair of affective hygiene. Regarding the cognitive, I have in mind principally a certain will to ignorance, the ruling of a whole domain of motives, reasons, explanations out of sight. The historical complexity, the density of argument, the diversity of parties in the Israel-Palestine conflict can be exasperating, no doubt. It's all too much. The exasperation only deepens on exposure to the intractabilities preventing the conflict's resolution, the objections and obstacles to a two-state solution, the objections and obstacles to a one-state solution, the unsustainability and miseries of no solution. And this in turn leads to a relentless simplifying of history, a ready gullibility, a willingness to believe any story however implausible, and a blithe embracing of fully contradictory positions. There must be a ceasefire, there must be resistance. International law must be kept, international law may be violated. The UN's authority must be upheld, the UN's authority may be disregarded. Think of the partition proposal, the partition resolution. There must be freedom of speech, there cannot be freedom of speech. Jews must be deplatformed. A politics of human rights is championed, a politics of human rights is repudiated, for example. Advocating hatred of a nation is contrary to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. These responses, culpably stupid, have attracted much support. Why? Wherein lies the appeal of this stance, this ideological position? First, it grants a general permission to engage in the otherwise impermissible. Feelings of envy, words of insult, blame and self-exculpation, snubbing and bullying, and deeds of violence, boycott and exclusion. All the ordinary restraints can be put aside. It is impossible, after all, to behave disgracefully to a people already in disgrace. The extensive deposits of hatred in our psychical reservoir find sanctioned expression, something that even passes for virtue. Second, these positions are central to the politics of today's global protest movement, as described by the late Fred Halliday of this university. What he said was a children's crusade of intellectual demagogues and dreamers. It comprises vague and often dangerous utopian ideas about an alternative world, a pleasing but vapid invocation of global human values and internationalism, an innocent when not indulgent attitude towards political violence, and a capitulation to nationalist and religious bigots. And of course, we see in it an instance of political life as it is lived today, a combination of polarization and stereotypical thinking, which in turn produces Manichaean perspectives, susceptible to a demagogic will to overstatement, a stark friend-enemy distinction, in which those persecuted are not even seen as fellow human beings, a paranoid style of expression. And last, of course, there is anti-Semitism. And this is the third proposition, and it's 7:10. I want to distinguish historical and novel elements in this current conjunction, this new conjunction. Anti-Semitism is always going to be shorthand for anti-Semitisms. Anti-Semitism is a heterogeneous phenomenon, the site of collective hatreds, anxieties, resentments. However, all versions of anti-Semitism libel Jews, and there are 5 such libels. There is the blood libel, which supposes that Jews entertain homicidal intentions towards non-Jews, and specifically non-Jewish children, and commit acts of murder either in reenactment of the crucifixion or to avenge their continuing collective punishment for that cosmic crime. Secondly, economic libel, which supposes that Jews who are self-interested, materialist, acquisitive, and unproductive by nature exploit non-Jews when they can and seek monopoly power the better to pursue their greater objectives. Even for a defamation lawyer, it's too much. The conspiracy libel supposes that Jews act in concert, in secret pursuit of goals inimical to the interests of non-Jews. That is, Jews conspire with other Jews. The silencing libel supposes that Jews cannot tolerate truth-tellers because they fear exposure of their plots, so they conspire together to silence their virtuous enemies. And the mendacity libel supposes that Jews proceed by deception and other forms of deceit. That is, Jews lie to non-Jews. A common version of the libel, common among anti-Semitic agitators of the 1930s and 40s, and which is now staged a return, anti-Semitism is a label used by Jews to protect themselves against criticism, or protect Israel against criticism. What my friend David Hirsch calls in non-honor of Ken Livingstone, the Livingstone formulation. The libels are founded on a notion of Jews as misanthropes of great but hidden power, a people apart. They're libelous because they're damaging to the good name of the Jewish people, and they circulate with full force today. The novel elements. In the online version, I talk about the ideology of settler colonialism. I'm not going to address that topic this evening. Allow me to just develop instead an argument about the collapse of the anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism distinction. Zionism is a Jewish cause, if not, as Herzl proposed, the Jewish cause. For many households, we know in post-war America, Judaism and Zionism were synonymous. According to a 2010 survey, 95% of British Jews said Israel plays some role in their Jewish identity, while 82% said it plays a central or important role. By the year 2050, Israel is projected to be home to the majority of the world's Jews. Zionism will always attract the attention of anti-Semites. Consider the case of the man filmed destroying an informal communal memorial to the 7th October dead, laid out in a square in Brighton. The video was published by the Telegraph online. You can still see it. The act of vandalism occurred in the late afternoon while it was still light. Cars drive past, the man acts in full view of drivers, pedestrians, people in the square. He looks about 50 years old. He's dressed in chinos and a short jacket, smartly. He could even give a lecture. Methodically, he works his way across the length of the memorial, picking up messages and notes, flowers, a teddy, other small objects, and he throws them aside. He throws aside an explanatory board at the center of the memorial. He then tries to tear up a large photograph and fails and tosses that aside too. A passerby challenges him, and the clip ends with the vandal pointing at the memorial wreckage. His body is arched in indignation as he's explaining to the passerby the necessity of what he's done. Among the details of this brutish behavior, the man's motivation, anti-Zionist or anti-Semitic, seems to me to be unimportant, even irrelevant. Consider the anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist organization that is Hamas. Hamas's program for the Jews is essentially one of extermination. It calls for victory and it plans a wasteland from the river to the sea. Palestine's liberation is to be achieved by sexual violence, by rape, by torture, by murder. This anti-Zionism wishes the state of Israel out of existence. It justifies the wish by insisting that the state should never have come into existence. No measures for its removal are objectionable. No price in death and destruction is too high. So-called peaceful solutions, says the 1988 Hamas Charter, are in contradiction to the principles of the Islamic resistance movement. Since this state, Israel, is comprised of its citizens, for Israel to disappear as Hamas requires, the Jewish citizens must disappear too. No distinction is made between soldiers and civilians, citizens and visitors, men and women, adults and children, all can be hunted down and killed. The Charter explains Israel, Judaism, and Jews challenge Islam and the Muslim people. May the cowards never sleep. It is sometimes protested. There is another more recent document to the 1988 Charter, the 2017 Document of General Principles and Policies. The Charter, however, has not been repudiated. And the 2017 document says Mashal represents our position for now. Even so, one can hear the 88 Charter in the 17 language. The Israel entity is the plaything of the Zionist project and its base of aggression. Hamas rejects any alternative to the full and complete liberation of Palestine from the river to the sea. We may say Hamas practice does not conform to the 2017 document in any respect, not in relation to its own violent actions, nor in relation to its incitements. In July 2019, a senior Hamas official, it was reported, urged Palestinians abroad to kill Jews in Israel and elsewhere. All of you 7 million Palestinians abroad, enough of the warming up. You have Jews everywhere, and we must attack every Jew on the globe by way of slaughter and killing. When this statement was put to Hamas, the response was that it did not represent Hamas's official position. Among the placards carried on Saturday marches were these two, held high. 1, wake up, our media, TV, radio and government are controlled by Zionists. And second, is our blood so sweet? We should all care about the Jew-hating content of these messages, but not spend a moment pondering whether they are anti-Semitic or anti-Zionist. Anti-Semitism is always a choice. Avoiding anti-Semitism is not difficult. Do not rejoice in murder. Leave the sadistic joy in the 7th October to political sociopaths. Do not share it. Do not tolerate the abuse of Jews. Do not indulge anti-Semitic conspiracies. Second, educate yourself in anti-Semitism's history. If you want to speak about it, learn something. Don't capitulate to that will to ignorance characteristic of so much discoursing today on the subject. Be open to Jewish perspectives. If a Jew says anti-Semitism, listen. Give Jews a voice. I do not propose a decisive voice. I do not insist, I am, therefore I know. But since anti-Semitism, we may say, moderately, disproportionately afflicts Jews, it is reasonable to suppose that they are likely to know things about it. Don't be faint-hearted. There is so much talk about the Jewish lobby among anti-Semitic progressives, talk which supports displays of phony bravado, but these types face no actual threat and risk nothing. Standing with Jews now seems to require some courage. Let me give one example. In January 2024, the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy cancelled an article about post-7th October Jewish trauma from its quarterly magazine. Why? It cited unease about the possible ramifications publication could have. Last, don't risk complicity in anti-Semitic positions. Let me quote Fred Halliday again. He drew attention to a mindset of anti-Jewish prejudice riven with racism and religious obscurantism in Islamist politics. He then adds this: it's worth recalling the saying of the German socialist leader Bebel, that anti-Semitism is the socialism of fools. The question of how many on the left are tolerant, if not actively complicit, he writes, in this foolery today is a painful one. I pause because Halliday is a much missed voice and was a friend of Chair tonight. Do not tolerate, make oneself complicit in anti-Semitism. Do not share space with anti-Semites. Do not forgive them for the sake of a common cause. Now apply these modest principles to the boycott question, notwithstanding that a boycott is a non-violent political practice, a form of activity of the autonomous self, one might say, and consecrated by the South African anti-apartheid movement, the reflex of most Jews, still by far the majority of Jews, who are committed to Israel as a Jewish project and are mindful of the history of boycotts, is to characterize boycotts of Israel as anti-Semitic. Why do they say that? In part because of the double standards applied. By what general principle can one justify the boycotting of Israel alone? In part because of the history of anti-Jewish boycotts, and in part because of the absence of any determinate political objective served by the boycott, other than the destruction of Israel. I don't myself think that every single boycotter is an anti-Semite, but I doubt whether any boycotters have given any thought to these Jewish objections, let alone the principles I just listed. And boycotters, we know, operate in a broader anti-Semitic environment which gives a general permission to pursue hostile acts against Jews. And there are further and specific arguments against academic boycotts and culture and industry boycotts, which, for those who are interested in those arguments, once again, please go online. Let me now turn to my last proposition. We live in a new conjuncture. Jews find themselves in this new conjuncture. It's not a new moment in what was the then given conjuncture. Prior to 7th October and the anti-Semitic responses to the terror attack, there was a general belief that among the world's liberal democracies, at least, the post-war interdiction of violence against Jews and the endorsement of that violence would be maintained, even if punctuated by anti-Semitic moments, short periods of intensified hostility towards Jews. We were wrong. The last year does not represent a mere pause or disruption in the post-war security of Jews. Why do I say this? First of all, there is the new quantum of anti-Semitic incidents. Of the 1,978 anti-Semitic incidents recorded by the CST in the first half of this year, 121 fell into the assault category. In 26 of these assaults, the offender threw eggs, stones, bricks, bottles, or other objects. 16 of the incidents from a passing vehicle. In 25 incidents, the victim was punched or kicked. In 19, the victim was spat at. In 16, the perpetrator stripped the victim of clothes or accessories. In 5, a non-lethal gun was fired. One incident involved a knife. In another incident, a car was driven into pedestrians. 73 of the attacks were accompanied by verbal abuse. Quantity matters. Anti-Semitism now has an everyday quality. But there's a new variety within this everyday quality. To the brute increase of anti-Semitic incidents, we must add, first, the fact that the first evidence of this increase followed a massacre of Jews, not violence by Jews. The worst week for anti-Semitic incidents in the UK was the week following the 7th October terror attack. And most of the anti-Semitic incidents reported to CST in the month after the 7th October affected Jewish children in mainstream schools. Second, the individual incidents that the CST gathers, and of course, what the CST gathers comprises only a fraction of what actually is happening, because those incidents have to be reported. But these individual incidents, the reported and the unreported ones, they occur in the context of what we may call an unboundaried, unpredictable atmosphere of menace. There was a leaflet in wide circulation in Finchley. Get fascists, racists, Nazis, Zionists, and Islamophobes out of Finchley. I mean, it's blackly comical and disturbing at the same time. The chant from London to Gaza, "We'll have an intifada," which I have heard in my own university, is a threat to all London's Jews, as is the placard carried by a demonstrator on a recent march, "In turn, all Zionists." According to a poll of British Jews in November 2023, 77% felt less safe as Jews living in the UK since the 7th of October. And last, the uneven age distribution among the reprehensible hostile responses. Simply put, the young were hostile, older people much less so. A poll published relatively recently, a UK poll, reported that this gap, in response to the statement, "Do you agree that reports that Hamas killed around 1,200 people on 7th October are not true?" The general public, 7%. Only 7% said it was not true, but 13% of young adults said they were not true. This is something more than the hum of ambient anti-Semitism growing steadily louder. Though for sure it's hard for Jews to hear themselves think and speak above that racket. Anti-Semitism is now too destabilizing, too attention-seeking to be understood as mere ambience. It's not background, it's foreground. It's not a presence, it is a disruptive activity in Jewish lives. The second reason why we're living in a new conjuncture is because of something which is really fresh and disturbing in our lives, in Jewish lives, which is a fracturing of the trust that Jews invest in this country in national institutions. That unqualified trust invested in universities, in the police, in the BBC, even the NHS, it's no longer fully intact. Now, this in itself would require a lecture to develop, but let this story stand inadequately for my general point. On the day of the 7th October massacre, while the rest of Britain's media were detailing the brutality of the Hamas attack, the BBC led its coverage with the headline, "Israel warns Gaza residents to flee homes ahead of revenge attacks." This was Israel as Shylock. "If you wrong us," protests Shylock, "shall we not revenge?" The extraordinary work that Danny Cohen has done on this, it's available online, I commend, on the BBC's coverage. The third aspect of this new conjuncture is a new militancy in relation to anti-Semitism in the Jewish world. There is now a general understanding that no benefit is to be derived from reasoning with anti-Semites. And this understanding has come from the experience of the responses to the 7th October, because implicit in the belief that there was scope for some kind of rational engagement was the conviction that certain words or actions against Jews, certain defamations or atrocities, would lead to reflection, a critical reconsideration of of hitherto unqualified allegiances, prejudices, the beginning of some understanding of complexities, a recoil from a Jew hatred, which then would be undeniable in its lethal vigor. But no, as it turned out, not at all. It's now clear, the very worst things having happened, and the most repellent things having been said, that the Jewish world can expect repetition of these things if the opportunity arises, and solicitous endorsement of them if the opportunity is taken. This has an important implication. No arguments, no reasons or facts, no appeals or compromises will weaken the enmity directed at us by people who wish us harm. We should drop all such efforts. I have 2 minutes, so I'm going to zip through 3 pages, and then we'll have questions, when you'll just hear me speak some more. Actually, I timed it quite well. There are two more reasons why we live in a new conjuncture, and then I have a conclusion. The third reason is there is a decline in the salience of the Jewish world's polarities. For some time now, the Jewish world has been constituted by 2 polarities: Israel and the diaspora, and within the diaspora, the United States and the rest of the world. 2 kind of binary, dynamic relations, one inside the other. But in critical respects, this vibrancy, and I think directly in consequence of 7th October, the vibrancy of these polarities has either faded because of a sense of common vulnerability in all the communities, or been recast as a kind of wary mistrust because of the ignominies and disgrace of the Netanyahu administration, particularly in the year before the terror attack. And last, there's a new acknowledgement of the Jewish world's diversity. The Jewish world is now divided between impossibilities, the 2-state solution, the 1-state solution, and intolerabilities, versions of what is called the occupation management paradigm. And there does not seem to be an available solution. Instead, in our Jewish world, we orient ourselves towards our own impossibility in order to lead a life, as Adorno would put it, less wrongly, and to keep alive, amidst all the death, the knowledge, as the Palestinian lawyer and writer Raja Shahada puts it, that the only future is for the 2 peoples to live together. It's been said that understanding anti-Semitism is a daunting task, and this may be true. I've spent much of my life struggling to understand it, too much, actually, of my life, as I'm constantly reminded by friends. But we can also overcomplicate things. So when the question is asked, what is anti-Semitism? When the question is asked, what is anti-Semitism, and there's not much time, it's okay to respond spitting at a Jewish student. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much.
It's so hot.
So, without delay, we will open the floor to questions. We will take 3 questions at a time. Can I please ask people to ask focused and pointed questions, not to give mini lectures? If you can, please say who you are, say your name before speaking. There will be roving microphones, so please wait until they get to you and speak only when you have the mic. So if people want to catch my eye, come on. Okay, great. So we have 1 question here, 2nd question there, and 3rd question there. We'll start with these 3 and then we'll do another one. Please say who you are.
Hello, thank you very much for your very stimulating talk. I'm Valerie Gonzalez. I'm the wife of Amichai Hanani. He's the one who brought me here. I have a question about is the endorsement by Jews of these ideas about Israel committing a genocide, for example, coming from Jews themselves. So is this a new kind of Semite anti-Semitism? Is it new? Or is it something that existed before? I experienced it a few times recently, after October 7th, in very unpleasant circumstances. And I wonder, and it disturbs me so deeply that it comes from Jews, that I wonder where is this coming from? How do you explain that you have, and you can see it, I mean, personally, this is how I view it, you can see this phenomenon by reading some articles in the Haaretz, which are literally, to me, it's a Semite anti-Semitism.
Okay, thank you. Yes, we had another, yes, please. Ask your question.
Thank you. Sydney Myers, we know each other. Anthony, you touched on the role played by the media towards the end of your outstanding talk in fueling anti-Zionism and hence anti-Semitism. I mean, only yesterday, I don't know if you saw, but the BBC reported that Israel will be delighted that Trump was elected because it will allow them to continue their devastating war in Gaza and Lebanon and against Iran. No context at all, just, you know, that's great for Israel, they'll love it, they can get on with the devastating war. I mean, I've actually often thought, this is quite controversial what I'm going to say, so warning, I've often thought that an uneducated person listening to the BBC, listening to James O'Brien on LBC, you know, reading certain newspapers, I frankly think they can be forgiven for hating Israel, given the unrelenting diet of libelous stories that they're fed. And I wondered if you would care to say if you agree with that.
Thank you. And we had another person here, please. Yes.
Good evening. I'm Phil Luther. I work in the human rights sector. You ended up at the end there on the definition of anti-Semitism and no argument about, of course, the example that you gave. I'm just interested in where you stand on some of the debates about the definitions, such as, you know, there's a bit of a debate about the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition, the alternative Jerusalem Declaration on anti-Semitism's alternative approach. Do you have a preference? What's your view on the debate?
Thank you. The first question, Jews who say stuff that is hostile to Jews. Jews have always been, we've always been divided against ourselves, and a great deal of what we say about each other is really most unwelcome. Of course, also, there has been throughout Jewish history, there has been a fraction of the Jewish world which has split off from the world and joined another rival world, and then taken a posture of overt antagonism towards that former world. In the Middle Ages, the most ferocious anti-Jewish clerical polemicists were former Jews. There becomes an element of a necessary proving of new loyalty. But in more recent times, in modern times, not particularly in contemporary times, with the diversity of Jewish positions just proliferating, a kind of combination of the first two has become much more problematical. That's to say, a combination of Jews just being unpleasant to each other, I can put it in that highly scholarly way, and Jews, ex-Jews, so to speak. In combination, you have something which is much more ideological, much more rooted, where you have competing understandings of what it is to be Jewish, what it is to be, so to speak, ideally Jewish. And that, I think, generates some of this hostility that one comes across now. Of course, it needs to be engaged with. I have to say, the expression self-hating Jew has never really appealed to me, not least because the people who are typically described as self-hating Jews are mostly very self-admiring Jews, who are proud to be ashamed to be Jewish on the spectacle of whatever it is that they're writing about. So that's what I have to say about that. As far as the point about media coverage creating a particular kind of common sense about the war, which is, I think, the point. Of course, that the Overton window, the parameters of what's understood to be so to speak, acceptable political discourse have moved very much against Jewish projects, Jewish undertakings. And even if the media, even if the media has not, so to speak, pushed the Overton window, it certainly reflects where it's standing. So I think that's my answer to that. The last point, definitions. I mean, definitions are always political activities. For centuries, it was not necessary as a, so to speak, admission card to a discussion about Jew hatred to bring one's own definition. And the fact that it's now necessary and that one has a kind of rather absurd and pointless kind of epiphenomenal debates about this or that definition is I really regard more as symptomatic of our miserable times than offering any kind of illumination. I have my own understanding of anti-Semitism, and it begins with spitting at Jews. So perhaps I should throw that into the mix too.
Thank you. Okay, we'll take 3 more questions, please. So we have one here, another here, and the person at the back. Please. Yes, you. Yes. You can wait for the microphone. So we had one. You raise your hand as well, right? Never. Yeah, you start, and then we'll move. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Mary Foot-Kandel. I'm a theologian. Thank you for your talk.
Can you speak up? I'm not sure.
Sure,
about it.
sorry. You mentioned that you were leaving the discussion of the settler colonialist discourse to your online presentation, but given that we're in a British context, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the claim that the Balfour Declaration should be viewed as an irredeemably sort of imperialist representation of much that is to be regretted in British imperialism and needs to be rethought in those terms, and how that British framing influences the experiences of British anti-Semitism.
pass on the mic maybe to... Yes, please.
Hindi Naiman. My question is really the flip side of the definitions question. My question is a nomenclature question. So, you talked about anti-Semitism, you talked about Jew hatred, but you also talked about the history of the development of hatred across centuries. And I'm really wondering if you would think out loud with us this evening about new conjectures demanding new terms for what we might call this now, and could this new nomenclature help people who are naive or talking about, are able to recognize new forms of hatred in a way that they wouldn't be able to recognize it if we called it anti-Semitism?
Thank you. And we had one question at the back.
So I'm Peter Kessler, and I'm interested in, Anthony, what you were saying about the distinction between criticism of Israel and hatred of Israel. And it seems to me that it's the point where those two things meet is the real problem area for a lot of the protesters that we see in our country today. And I agree with you that a lot of them don't want to be anti-Semites, that they find themselves cast either by themselves or by others into that position. How do we show such people where this hard to identify boundary exists between criticism and hatred?
Thank you.
So the Balfour Declaration, it's Walter Benjamin's remark about even the past is not safe from the fascists comes to my mind, because why should we be involved? Why should the argument be constructed or framed in this way that we should be involved in defending the Balfour Declaration and, so to speak, purging it of its historical contingencies as the precondition to making a case for the legitimacy of a nation state which has existed by fiat of the United Nations for decades now. I would simply say that, of course, the Balfour Declaration is the creature of its very precise moment towards the end of the First World War, when alliances were being sought rather than part of some larger imperial conspiracy. But I'm always struck by two things when people talk about the Balfour Declaration. The first is that they completely occlude the essentially antagonistic relation between the British and the Jews. And secondly, and maybe specifically, they do not take into account another document of the British government, which was of much greater consequence, because I think that we know the Yishuv was already established by 1917. I think that there would have been a Jewish state even without the Balfour Declaration, but we know for a fact that were it not for the 1939 White Paper, many thousands, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of Jews killed in the Shoah would not have been killed, and their children and their grandchildren would be alive today. So I don't think myself that the Jewish world, the Jewish people, owe a particular debt to Britain because of the Balfour Declaration, but I think there is a reckoning with Britain because of the 1939 White Paper, which, for the history lesson, kept Jews, essentially limited Jewish emigration to Palestine to paltry numbers, at a time when the rest of the world essentially had closed its borders. That's the Balfour Declaration. The second point on nomenclature and definitions. Of course, the word anti-Semitism was invented by an anti-Semite. It's invented by a German called Marr, because he wanted to give Jew hatred a kind of fancy scientific quality to it, and because he wanted to give it a specifically racist dimension, so that every Jew would be caught in its maw. Do we need it? No, we don't need it. We can think of Jew hatred, and you've probably noticed this evening that I've been talking more about that, because it's a way of thinking about the impact on Jews of certain forms of behavior and action, which take the consideration to the place where it needs to be, which is how Jews experience this hostility, rather than in, I mean, really what are exceptionally trivial arguments of definition, and I think also highly politically conditioned arguments about nomenclature. You can have a pointless 3-hour argument with somebody about the IHRA definition or anti-Semitism versus anti-Zionism. It's quite difficult to have an argument with somebody about spitting at a Jew. You're either for it or you're against it. You know, hands up who's in favor of spitting on Jews. It's a good place to start. The third point, Peter's point about criticism and hatred, one of the pernicious aspects of the circulation of the genocide libel is that it actually deprives Jews in the political argument about what's happening now from making the very simple point that it's Hamas which is engaged in the genocidal project. I mean, specifically and narrowly within the Genocide Convention, it wishes to destroy a nation. And the evidence for that is everywhere. It's not difficult. And I don't understand, I have to say, why, in this characteristic manner in which we invest gigantic efforts in hot defense, but very little effort in offense. I'm talking now about our discursive engagements as a Jewish world. I don't understand why the point is not made that the genocidaires are on the other side. I think that answers, I hope that answers the point.
Okay, we have a few more minutes left for final questions. So the person with a yellow jumper, please. And we'll have one more person here and final question here. I think that's what we will have time. If you can keep it brief, given that we're only a few minutes left. Thank you.
Hi, Emily Sinclair. My question is, what do you think are the benefits and potential drawbacks of, in this country, most forms of anti-Semitism not actually being illegal?
Not being
Illegal.
Illegal? Oh, okay.
Thank you. Yes, we had a question here.
Joanna Mishek. I'm a historian of anti-Semitism, and I wanted to ask you about the emotional aspects, the features of anti-Semitism.
The
emotional features,
yeah.
the power of emotion. And of course, it seems to me that behind this cognitive ignorance, there must be a lot of emotions. And emotions played an important role in triggering anti-Jewish violence, various policies through ages, but this is very pronounced after October 7, and also in rationalization of these anti-Jewish practices, as well as in minimalization of anti-Jewish practices. So how do you see this as a lawyer and as a scholar of anti-Semitism?
My name is Arjen Bakker. And my question is, in an age of global migration, against which national borders are largely ineffective, is there any hope in a defense of Zionism that employs the ostensibly outdated logic of the nation state?
So you have the mission impossible answering briefly three big questions.
So it's, I think, the kind of really, the horrible stuff that I mentioned, particularly the actions, they are illegal. The problem is not the illegality, but the prosecution policy. I mean, when people from Bradford can drive down through Golders Green and Hendon, shouting "fuck the Jews" and rape their daughters, can be captured on camera and investigated by the police, and the decision then taken not to prosecute. You're not talking about a failure of the criminal law, you're talking about a failure of the criminal justice system, which is a different kind of problem. The affective aspects, the emotional aspects of anti-Semitism, it's an exceptionally well put question. I think I'm open to that dimension, and I agree. I mean, in a sense, it's a necessary consequence of one acknowledging the non-rational nature of anti-Semitic hatred, that one is driven to a kind of an affective alternative logic. So I agree. On the third point, I mean, one hears a great deal about the outdated logic of the nation state, and this was the position taken by the late Tony Judt in the New York Review of Books decades ago. Israel is going one way, while so to speak, history is going in the other direction. But against the logic of global migration, there is also a counter logic of the reassertion of boundaries and borders and national identity. And it may well be that as that intensifies, Israel will be seen not as a late entrant, but as a precursor.
On this note, I want to thank again Anthony for a fascinating and much needed talk. Can I ask people to stay seated until we go out and then leave the room? Thank you very, very much. Thank you.